Hey everybody, this is the Translators notes for No Von's in the Crossfire, Adventures of a Vietnamese Revolutionary. It's probably going to just be like, it's tedious footnotes, so, but I think it'll actually have some very good information in it. And I am not going to, if there's a footnote if there's an endnote in the book, I'm not going to keep flipping back and forth to these, back and forth from the page to the translator's notes over and over again. That's fucking irritating. So, forgive me. So, what's it? I don't know. When it's how when they do, like, the first note is from, like, the preface. So the page notes are in, like, the page numbers in Roman numerals. So if I start from 8 and then end up saying 1 again, it means I've escaped from the footnotes, from the preface and the foreword and all that noise to the actual piece. So, anyway, page 8, Roman numerals. Some web sources give the misleading impression that there was a significant anarchist influence in early Vietnamese struggles. Closer examination usually reveals that the supposed connection is extremely flimsy. The pioneer anti-colonial leader Phan Boi Chau, for example, is sometimes referred to as a, quote, proponent of anarchism, end quote, merely because, quote, Phan Boi Chau's thinking reflected certain distinctly anarchist themes, notably anti-imperialism and direct action, end quote, and because Phan Boi Chau was on good terms with a few anarchists he met in Japan and China, although Phan Boi Chau was on equally good terms with monarchists, nationalists, socialists, and militarists, and the organizations Phan Boi Chau founded advocated nothing more radical than a constitutional monarchy or a democratic republic. Phan Boi Chau's overriding goal was to drive out the French. Political groups and ideologies interested Phan Boi Chau only insofar as they might contribute to that goal. Until late in his life, Phan Boi Chau scarcely manifested any interest even in socialism, let alone anarchism. For more on Phan Boi Chau, see note 155. Like I said, as goes for all these videos, all the videos on my channel, take all my pronunciations with a grain of salt. I pronounce a lot of things wrong, and I'm definitely going to be pronouncing words wrong in this because I know nothing about the Vietnamese language, and I know very little about Vietnamese history. So I'm going to be pronouncing a lot of things wrong, so you'll have to bear with me. But anyway, Nguyen An Ninh is a different matter. Nguyen An Ninh's eclectic and romantic perspective did indeed reflect some anarchist influence picked up from Nguyen An Ninh's years in Paris. This anarchism was blended with a variety of other European philosophical and cultural currents from Rousseau to Nietzsche, and since Nguyen An Ninh was a very popular and charismatic figure, those themes undoubtedly had some influence during the 1920s, particularly among the more educated urban youth. Hugh Tam Ho Thai's Radicalism and the Origins of the Vietnamese Revolution gives a good account of the cultural ferment of that period, which served as a prelude to the more direct social and political struggles of the 1930s. The only explicit Vietnamese anarchist mentioned in the present book is Trinh Hung Nau. Trinh Hung Nau. Other sources describe Trinh Hung Nau as a, quote, nationalist with anarchist leanings, end quote. According to No Von, he participated in the Jeune Annam movement of 1926 and in the newspaper La Annam 1926 to 1928, and was one of the founders of La Lutte 1933. But Trinh Hung Nau withdrew from La Lutte after the third issue, quote, because he was unable to express his anarchist ideal within it, end quote. Trin Hung Nao later took part in the Indo-Chinese Congress movement 1936 to 1937. Page Roman numeral 8, allusion to Orwell, quote, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." That's from 1984, Part 1, Chapter 3. Page Roman numeral... Shit, that's not page 8. No, it is page... No, it's 8. Page... Wait, the last page I said was Roman numeral 13. That's what I meant to say. Roman numeral... page number 14. Roman numeral. Here is Baudelaire's poem, 1851, followed by a translation. I'm not going to even try to read the French. The cracked bell. It is bitter and sweet during the winter nights to listen beside the quivering, smoking fire to distant memories slowly rising at the sound of the bells chiming in the fog. Blessed is the strong-throated bell, alert and healthy despite its old age, which faithfully sends forth its pious tones, like an old soldier keeping watch under his tent. But my soul is cracked, and when in its distress, it wants to fill the cold night air with its songs, it often happens that its enfeebled voice seems like the thick death rattle of a wounded man forgotten, beside a lake of blood, lying beneath a mass of corpses, dying but unable to move despite immense efforts. And that's the end of the poem. That is a fairly literal translation. For some more poetic attempts, none very satisfactory, see fleursdumal.org, quote, 100 flowers, end quote, that's just a link to a different translation of the poem. Page number 17, Roman numerals, quote, 100 Flowers, end quote, movement, 1956 to 1957, a campaign initiated by the Chinese Communist government encouraging people to freely express their views on national policy questions. When millions of letters were received, most of them highly critical of the Maoist regime, the movement was brought to a prompt halt, and most critical authors were rounded up and interned in, quote, re-education, end quote, camps. Mao would later say that the 100 Flowers campaign was it drawing snakes from behind their rocks or something like that. Basically, viewing it as like a loyalty test. Anyway, page number Roman numeral 14, lines from Brassen's song Les Funérailles d'Antan, funerals of long ago. 1. The quote is from Pascal's Pensée, number 593. Note that the numbering is different in some editions. 2. Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939. In July 1936, the fascistic general Francisco Franco, supported by Hitler and Mussolini, launched a military uprising against the recently elected Popular Front government. The latter, fearing genuine popular autonomy, had refused to arm the people, thereby enabling Franco's forces to rapidly take over half of the country. Seeing no alternative, the anarchist-oriented workers and peasants bypassed the government, seized arms, and themselves took up the fight against Franco, a process that rapidly overflowed into a widespread and very radical social revolution. The Spanish Communist Party did everything in the Spanish Communist Party's power to crush this revolution in the name of unity in the struggle against Franco, who ultimately prevailed anyway, in part due to the demoralization resulting from the Stalinist vicious attacks on the popular revolution. The best general history is Bernat Bulletin's The Spanish Civil War. See also Sam Dolgoff's edited volume, The Anarchist Collectives, Worker Self-Management in the Spanish Revolution, 1936 to 1939. Punistas, members of the Party of Marxist Unification, Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista, a revolutionary Marxist party allied with the anarchists opposed to Stalinism and somewhat at odds with Trotskyism. During the Spanish Civil War, the Pumistas were hunted down and killed or imprisoned by the Stalinists. George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia is an account of his experiences fighting in the POUM militia. What was I going to say? From my understanding, the POUM was like a combination of like left oppositionists and right oppositionists, people who unified under one group. I think that's where the unification part of the name comes from. I'm not exactly sure about that. During the Spanish Civil War, the Trotskyist group were represented by the Bolshevik Leninists under the leadership of Grandizo Muniz, who I think eventually came to more libertarian positions himself. I think he moved to Mexico, where the Trotskys were living. And in the years after Trotsky's assassination, I think he grew pretty close to Victor Serge. And maybe I'm wrong about the Victor Serge part. He definitely grew close to Natalia Sadova Trotsky, or Natalia Sadova. I can't remember what the proper name is, but I always read it as Natalia Sadova Trotsky. And he eventually was, Muniz was pretty influential in pushing her towards more of a state capitalist conception of the USSR, and so she formally broke with I think she died in the 1960s, but I think she formally broke with the Fourth International of the Trotskyist Fourth International in like 1949 or 1950, 1951, like the really late 1940s or the really early 1950s, on the grounds that they dogmatically held to the view of the USSR as a degenerated worker state, despite all of its reactionary behavior over the last 15 years. If Trotsky's analysis as of the USSR as a degenerated worker state was sensible in Trotsky's lifetime, it certainly was not sensible afterwards. There's I would really like to know more about some of these other leftist groups. Homage to Catalonia is on this channel, not on this channel, on YouTube, and I would highly recommend you listening to the audiobook of that if you've never read the book. It is phenomenal. I would say Homage to Catalonia might be, if I was to try to get someone who's curious about radical politics, the two pieces I'd probably give them to check out first would be Homage to Catalonia, Michael Heinrich's introduction to the 3 volumes of Capital, and Hal Draper's The Two Souls of Socialism. And I think they'd be on a good track to, I think they'd be on sturdy ground with that. So yeah, check Homage to Catalonia out if you've never read it. Anyway, workers' councils. The council form was invented by striking workers during the 1905 Russian Revolution. Soviet is the Russian word for, quote, council, end quote. When Soviets reappeared in 1917, they were successively supported, manipulated, dominated, and co-opted by the Bolsheviks, who soon succeeded in transforming the councils into parodies of themselves, rubber stamps of the, quote, Soviet state, end quote. Workers' councils have nevertheless continued to reappear spontaneously at the most radical moments in subsequent history in Germany, Italy, Spain, Hungary, and elsewhere, including the 1945 Hungai Kampa, quote, commune, end quote, in Vietnam, because they represent the obvious solution to the need for a practical form of non-hierarchical popular self-organization. The classic work on the subject is Anton Pannekoek's Workers' Councils, which I am intending to read soon. Bavaria. Following the surrender of Germany at the end of World War I, November 1918, the Bavarian region of Germany overthrew its local monarchy and declared itself an independent state, with independent socialist Kurt Eisner as prime minister, supported by councils of workers and soldiers. Eisner's assassination in February 1919 was followed by a chaotic and rapidly changing succession of more or less radical regimes, including a short-lived, quote, councilist republic, end quote, whose leaders included anarchist Erich Mühsam, Gustav Landauer, Ernst Toller, and Ret Marut, or B. Traven. It was militarily crushed in May 1919 by the German, quote, socialist government, end quote. Kronstadt. In March 1921, the sailors of Kronstadt, who had been among the most ardent participants in the 1917 Russian Revolution, revolted against the communist government, calling for a genuine power of popular democratic Soviets as opposed to the rule of the, quote, Soviet state, end quote. Denounced as reactionaries, they were crushed by the communist regime. See Ida Metz's The Kronstadt Uprising and Paul Averich's Kronstadt 1921. I don't have Averich's Kronstadt 1921 on the channel, but I do have Ida Metz's The Kronstadt Uprising on this channel, so check that out. I also have a few other pieces from Kronstadt, about Kronstadt, including primary source documents from the event. Back to the text. Hungary in 1956, the people of Hungary revolted against the Russian-imposed Stalinist regime. Though the movement was nominally in favor of a reform government under Imre Nagy, a nationwide network of workers' councils was the real power in the country until it was crushed by the invading Russian army. See Annie Anderson's Hungary 1956, or Hungary 56. I don't think I have anything on Hungary 56, but I do have pieces by from Castoriadis that would where Hungary was emphasized, the importance of Hungary was emphasized. The Marx quote is from Critical Notes on the article, quote, "The King of Prussia and Social Reform," end quote. So I guess we're into the actual pages of the book now. I guess I didn't realize that. But page 3, Sûreté, French colonial security police in charge of investigating criminal and political offenses. Coolie, roughly equivalent to, quote, day laborer, end quote. Quote, coolie, end quote, was the common term used by the Chinese and Vietnamese, as well as their colonial rulers, for the lowest level workers, unskilled and illiterate. Coolies were paid the bare minimum for hard physical labor. Annamite. Following the tradition of the previous Chinese rulers, the French referred to the entire indigenous Vietnamese population as, quote, Annamites, end quote. Although Annam was only one of 3 Vietnam regions in French Indochina, the term was still widely used during the period described in this book, although Annamite was tending to be replaced by, quote, Vietnamese, end quote, during the 1930s and 1940s. 4. Of the confiscated books, Paul Gentizon's Mustafa Kemal ou l'Orient and Marche, Mustafa Kemal or the Orient on the Move, of 1929, is about the Turkish nationalist leader Kemal Ataturk. George Garreau's Forcerie Humaine, Human Hothouse, of 1926, is about early anti-colonial struggles in Vietnam. Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, 1847, is a crucial historical document that has little connection with the, quote, communist, end quote, parties of the 20th century. Leon Trotsky's The Permanent Revolution, 1929, expounding Trotsky's view that the bourgeoisie in Russia and in even more underdeveloped countries would be unable or unwilling to carry out a, quote, bourgeois democratic revolution, end quote, and that therefore the proletariat would need to take the lead to accomplish such a goal, and that in so doing it would push things beyond the bourgeois state. Louis Roubaud's Vietnam, La Tragédie Indochinoise, I don't know. Vietnam, the Indo-Chinese Tragedy, 1931, is a denunciation of colonial repression. John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World, 1922, is a first-hand account of the Russian Revolution. The Marx biography is probably David Ryazanov's Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, An Introduction to Their Lives and Works, 1927. I actually have a copy of that book. Sun Yat-sen, 1866 to 1925, was a leader of the Chinese Revolution of 1911 and founder of the Kuomintang Chinese Nationalist Party. Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front of 1928 is an anti-war novel about World War I. Silvio Pellico's My Prisons of 1833 is an account of 10 years in Italian prisons. Page 5. Central Prison, Maison Centrale, literally, quote, Central House, end quote, the main Saigon prison. 9. Lines from Victor Hugo's poems Dictée après Juillet, or Juillet, 1930. dictated after July 1930, about the 1930 revolution. Page 10. No Van was very big by Vietnamese standards, 6 feet tall, so average size clothes would not fit him. Yeah, in the picture, actually, no, I did actually notice that. Now that it says something, like the picture of him that's in this book, he is very tall. Yeah, he's like, he's got like the body of like a Swedish man. Page 11. Unless otherwise indicated, quote, League always refers to the League of Internationalist Communists, the Trotskyist group founded by Lu San Han, No Van, and Trinh Phan Lao in 1935, destroyed in 1939, and revived in 1945. In contrast to the, quote, legal Trotskyist, end quote, of the La Lutte group, who took part in elections and registered their publications, the LIC was an illegal group which focused on underground organizing and clandestine publications. In May 1936, a Popular Front government, an alliance of socialist, communists, and other more or less page 12. In May 1936, a Popular Front government, an alliance of socialist, communists, and other more or less center-left parties was elected in France. The Popular Front government's inception was accompanied by a nationwide wave of strikes and factory occupations. Page 17. Notables. Wealthy, literate, or respected local, quote, worthies, end quote, councils of notables were the administrative power in the peasant communities under the old imperial regime and continued under the French colonial regime to serve as the lowest rung of the administration, collecting taxes, rounding up conscripts, dispensing justice for minor crimes, etc. Page 18. Paulo Condor, a.k.a. Con Son Island, an island lying off the coast of southern Vietnam. In 1861, the French colonial government built a penal colony there to hold political prisoners. In 1954, it was turned over to the South Vietnamese government, which continued to use it for the same purpose. It attained international notoriety in July 1970 when American congressional representatives, following a map drawn by a former inmate, broke away from the official guided tour and uncovered horrendous ill treatment of prisoners. Photographs of some of the horrors, quote, tiger cages, torture-caused mutilations, etc., appeared in Life magazine and contributed to the growing American opposition to the Vietnam War. Page 20. In traditional Vietnamese families, the first child is referred to as number 2 to fool the evil spirits who would like to make off with the firstborn. No Van's narrative mentions sister 2, sister 5, brother 7, all from a previous marriage, brother 10, brother 12, brother 13, Van himself the youngest, so there was a total of 12 children in his family. The ones not mentioned had either died young or grown up and moved away, as had sister 2 and sister 5. Brother 10 was tortured to death by the French in 1946. Page 26. Vu. Short for vu et approuvé, seen and approved. The French word would seem, quote, Kabbalistic, end quote, mysterious to the Vietnamese children. Page 27. Capitation tax. A personal tax imposed on each adult individual regardless of income. Though trivial for the rich or middle classes, it amounted to a significant portion of a poor person's wages and a virtual impossibility for peasants living largely outside the money economy. Page 30. Lady Hugh's banya tree, planted in memory of a generous rich lady who lived near No Van's village, provided shade for women returning from the market under the hot sun. See No Van and Hélène Fleury's Conte des Autrefois du Vietnam. Page 40. Slightly abridged passage from Baudelaire's preface to Pierre Dupont's Chant et Chanson, 1849. Page 41. Constitutionalist Party. A very moderate reformist tendency that began in 1917 as a loose interest group of merchants, landowners, bureaucrats, and journalists that became an officially recognized political party circa 1923. It sought liberalization of certain laws and increased status for a small elite of Vietnamese bourgeois and officials under French rule, but opposed demands for national independence or significant social reforms. Its main leader, Bui Quang Chu, had a horror of mass democracy, to say nothing of mass action. The notion of granting voting rights and access to French citizenship to a somewhat larger segment of the population caused him to, quote, shudder at the thought of admitting undesirables into the great French family, people without means of livelihood and without culture, ... I cannot help being seriously disturbed when I think of it. By some extraordinary measures, mass naturalization was decreed in Cochin, China. The result of a legislative election could depend on the vote of our cooks and rickshaw boys, end quote. The fact that the colonists for whom de la Chevrotière was one of the leading spokesmen could view such timid reformists as dangerously radical gives some measure of how reactionary the French colonial system was. Phan Chau Trinh and the other early anti-colonial leader, Phan Boi Chau, see note 155. Page 43. The quote is from Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Discourse on the Origin of Inequality of 1754. Richepin's La Chanson des Gueux of 1876 was considered so immoral and obscene that the author, publisher, and printer were each sentenced to a month in prison. The Gueux were not only tramps, but the down-and-out in general, beggars, pickpockets, vagabonds, homeless street people, etc. 44. Van Van Trong's Une histoire des conspirateurs anonymes à Paris, 1928, was reprinted with an introduction by Novan, La Insomniaque Press, 2003. The quotation is from pages 20 to 21 of that edition. Page 45. Quote, Nguyen An Ninh Secret Society, end quote. The existence of this supposed secret society remains doubtful. Most of the, quote, evidence, end quote, for its stories of bizarre initiation rites, etc., was concocted by the Sûreté, who again are like this Vietnamese, French Vietnamese secret police or something like that. Like the, what's the word? I'm trying to think of what the Russian secret police were called before the Cheka. Ochrana? Is that what it is? The French Ochrana of Vietnam. On the other hand, it's hard to imagine that Nguyen An Nhinh's wanderings through the countryside did not have some subversive aims. In 1926, Nguyen An Ninh had made public statements to the effect that he was inclined towards a more spiritual path and expressed interest in the recently formed Cao Dai sect. In early 1928, Nguyen An Ninh shaved his head like a Buddhist monk and began traveling by bicycle from village to village, selling a medicinal balm that he had concocted. Though Nguyen An Ninh himself does not seem to have done any, quote, organizing, end quote, his comrades may have done so among the peasants who gathered around to meet him and listen to his talks, or other underground groups may have used his name as a rallying symbol to enhance their own appeal, or there may simply have been loose associations among people who shared a sympathy with him and his, quote, teachings, end quote. After refuting most of the evidence of the existence of such a secret society, Novan noted that, quote, Ninh inspired the peasants with a quasi-mystical confidence. Many of the peasants felt ready to follow Ninh without knowing exactly where or how. ... Ninh had succeeded in creating a virtual peasant movement, though one far removed from a disciplined and structured organization, end quote. Vietnam, 1920 to 1945. See also Hu Tam Hao Thai's Radicalism and the Origins of the Vietnamese Revolution. Bazin, a detailed account of the association Hoang Dan Dao's Vietnam Coc Dan Dang, A Contemporary History of National Struggle 1927 to 1954, gives the name of René Bazin. Most web references give Hervé Bazin, but this may be simply a case of erroneous mention in Wikipedia being endlessly repeated. Page 46. 40% death rate. Although this may seem improbably high, official sources confirm that very high death rates were common. For example, the Phu Rang plantation supervisors informed the French colonial minister that 17% of their workers died in 1927, and this was undoubtedly a conservative figure since the supervisors had an interest in covering up as many deaths as possible. Reliable studies indicate that many of the plantations had an average annual death rate of over 20%. Yan Bai Revolt, 1930. This revolt was instigated by the Vietnam Quoc Don Dong National Party of Vietnam, a radical nationalist organization founded in Hanoi in 1927 by the young teacher Nguyen Thai Hoc. By the following year, it had 1,500 members organized into 120 clandestine cells. Its violent audacity alarmed the colonial regime, but soon brought about its downfall. The 1929 assassination of Ba Zin by a renegade VNQDD member led to numerous arrests. The defeat of the Yen Bai revolt a year later led to the group's virtual annihilation. Nguyen Thai Hoc and 12 other leaders were guillotined and hundreds of others were captured and given heavy sentences. VNQDD never really recovered from this blow, though remnants of the group escaped to southern China and returned to Vietnam 15 years later in the aftermath of World War II, fighting in the ranks of the, quote, 3rd Division, end quote, that appears in Chapter 7. Page 48. Names in parentheses usually refer to provinces. Han Lam, Tang Chung, thus means the town or village of Han Lam in the province of Tang Chung. Note also that most of the events described in this book took place in Cochin, China, the southern region of Vietnam, unless it is specifically indicated that they took place in Annam, the central region, or Tonkin, the northern region. Page 50. Indo-Chinese Communist Party. This name was imposed by the Comintern in the hope of eventually including insurgent groups from Laos and Cambodia, but in reality the ICP was always almost exclusively Vietnamese. This is one of those things that people talk about, is like, it doesn't actually quite make sense why, at least in my opinion, I think, maybe, at least I've read this wrong, it was like, so it kind of confused, like, it's not particularly necessary, like, it's not particularly transparent why there should be 3 different states in this area. But people don't call for a one-state solution for Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, even though extremely bloody conflicts emerged out of their them becoming separate states. Just as a side note. Page 52, quote, Moscow trainees, end quote. Retour de Moscou, literally, quote, returnees from Moscow, end quote. Radicals who had spent time in Moscow being trained as cadres for the Communist Party. Page 55, restricted residence. Interdiction de séjour, an order specifying that someone had to live in a particular place or was banned from particular places. Page 56, Saigon City Council. In order to create the appearance of democracy in Cochin, China, the French colonial regime established a few, quote, representative, end quote, bodies such as municipal and colonial councils. These bodies had very limited powers, and in any case, only a tiny percentage of property-owning natives were allowed to vote, so that the allotted portion of the indigenous representatives tended to be fairly conservative. 60. Invitation à voyage, invitation to travel, title of Baudelaire's poem. Page 67, line from Baudelaire's poem, Moesta e eribunda, sad and restless, 1855. Page 77, Moscow trials, 1936 to 1938. Notorious frame-ups now universally discredited, in which many of the original leaders of the Bolshevik Party gave false and even obviously absurd, quote, confessions, end quote, and were then shot. Trotsky, then in exile, was considered the arch-villain and was tried in absentia. The other old Bolsheviks confessed to conspiring with Trotsky and with Wall Street or the Nazis or the Japanese imperial government to assassinate Stalin, sabotage Russian production, etc. The trials helped Stalin get rid of potential rivals and discourage any resistance to his power. But the idea that the majority of the original leaders of the October Revolution had been plotting against, quote, the Soviet regime, end quote, for years was so obviously absurd that it disillusioned countless Communist Party members and sympathizers around the world. Indo-Chinese Congress movement of 1936 to 1937, an attempt to take advantage of the election of the Popular Front government in France by organizing popular action committees throughout Indochina, which would send delegates to meet in a congress in Saigon to present demands for improving conditions in Indochina. The idea turned out to be very popular and hundreds of committees were organized, but the colonial regime suppressed the movement before any congress could convene. Page 79. Auprès de ma blonde, popular French song dating from the 17th century. Les Thèmes du Mépris, Days of Contempt, 1935 novel about a communist militant imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp. Page 81. Céline's Voyage au bord de la nuit was published in 1932. The passage quoted are from Ralph Mannheim's translation, Journey to the End of the Night, New Directions, Journey to the End of the Night, published in 1983, with a few slight modifications. The last two lines are from a 1913 popular song. Page 86. Lenin's, quote, testament, end quote. Letter written during Lenin's last illness in December 1922 to the Russian Communist Party, stating his view on how the regime should proceed following his death. The letter featured a sharp attack on Stalin's brutality and deceitfulness and urged his removal from the position of General Secretary of the party. It also criticized Trotsky's bureaucratic tendencies. The, quote, testament, end quote, was suppressed by the Stalinists and officially acknowledged only in 1956 by Khrushchev. Page 90. The renowned writer Andrei Gide had sympathized with communism, but following a visit to the USSR in 1936, Gide expressed his disillusionment and returned from the USSR in 1936 and Afterthoughts on the USSR in 1937. Page 101, quotation from Victor Hugo's play Ruy Blas, 1938. Page 112, Vichy government, 1940 to 1944, a fascist puppet state in the southeastern area of France which remained nominally independent after the defeat of French forces by Nazi Germany. Marshal Philippe Pétain was head of state, and his government cooperated with the Nazis who had occupied the rest of the country. 116. Page 116. The Indochina colonial administration was pro-Vichy. The Japanese occupation forces had felt comfortable leaving it in place. After the defeat of the Vichy regime in France, August 1944, the colonial administration's loyalty to Japan became much more doubtful, particularly in the event of an Allied invasion. The Japanese thus felt obliged to take over the direct administration of Indochina and to preempt a potential French rebellion. Bao Dai, the last emperor of Vietnam. During the Japanese occupation, Bao Dai, quote, ruled, end quote, as a Japanese puppet. In 1945, Bao Dai went into exile, then returned in 1949 to rule as a French puppet during the Indochina War. In 1955, Bao Dai was ousted by his prime minister, No Diem, and emigrated to France. Page 122, Nam Bo, quote, South Country, end quote, another name for Cochin China, the southern part of Vietnam. Page 124, quote, 3rd Division, end quote, an independent nationalist anti-colonialist army, including surviving members of the VNQDD led by Nguyen Hoa Hiep. The division sometimes had as many as 15,000 men and successfully fought both the French and the Viet Minh from late 1945 to early 1946. The 3rd Division was eventually forced to disband and disperse into the population, in part because the Viet Minh had begun providing the French with information on its locations and movements. Page 127. Gluck Haas, Nepalese soldiers serving in the British colonial army. Page 138. Quote, Tao Tu Tao's group, end quote. It is unclear what group this refers to. Tran Van Tak's final note. This photocopy was sent to No Van by Tran Van Tak's son. It reads, quote, Brother love, I leave my children in your hands. Please take care of them. Page 145. The Indochina War, the war between the Vietnamese, primarily the Viet Minh, once it had destroyed all rival opposition forces, and the French, is usually considered to have begun in December 1946, but there were preliminary maneuvers and skirmishes during the previous year. The Viet Minh received aid from Russia and China after the Chinese Stalinist victory in 1949, and the French were largely supported by the United States. The war ended in 1954 with the defeat of the French at Dien Bien Phu. At the Geneva Conference in July 1954, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were granted independence. Vietnam was temporarily partitioned between the north, ruled by the Viet Minh, and the south, ruled by Emperor Bao Dai. Pending a nationwide election, he would unify the country. After deposing Bao Dai, South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem refused to go through with such an election, being aware that the Viet Minh would easily win it. When the Viet Cong, a new incarnation of the Viet Minh, began attacking Diem's dictatorship in the late 1950s, the United States backed Diem with money, arms, advisors, and eventually hundreds of thousands of troops. The Second Indochina War of 1960 to 1975, more commonly known as the Vietnam War, was ultimately won by the guerrilla forces of the Viet Cong and the regular army of North Vietnam. Page 148. World Without Visa, 1947. Novel about an international group of exiles stuck in Vichy, France during World War II. The author, Jean Malacquy, later took part in the Council Communist group mentioned on page 203. Page 153. Quote, October Group, end quote. So-called from its 1931 to 1932 journal, Tang Moi, October. Although this is the only use of the term in the present book, in other accounts, particularly Trotskyist ones concerned with retrospectively distinguishing the correct or incorrect lines of different groups, quote, the October Group, or the, quote, October tendency, end quote, is often used in a loose general way to refer to the ongoing tendency around Hu Tong, which is contrasted with the La Lutte Group. In this broadest sense, the, quote, October, end quote, tendency is seen as including the League of Internationalist Communists for the construction of the Fourth International, 1935 to 1939. The Bolshevik Leninists for the construction of the Fourth International, 1936. The journal Les Militants, 1936 to 1937. The revived journal Tang Moi, 1938-1939. The Bulletin Tai To, 1938. The Saigon Paper Tia Sang, 1939. And the revived League of Internationalist Communists, 1945 to 1946. These groups and publications criticized the La Lutte Group for its accommodation with the Stalinists, intending to put more stress on underground grassroots or agitation, but the two tendencies also overlapped and collaborated in many regards. This is probably why No Van, though pointing out particular tactical differences in particular circumstances, did not use the, quote, October Group, end quote, label, so as not to present the history as a simplistic struggle between two distinct rival currents. 1 second. Gotta get some water. Get thirsty here. Excuse me. Where am I? Page 155. Phan Boi Chau, 1867 to 1940, pioneering anti-colonial leader. In 1904, Phan Boi Chau founded the Vietnamese Modernization Society, whose goal was to drive the French from Indochina and establish a constitutional monarchy under the rebel prince Quang Day. The following year, he and Quang Day slipped out of the country and went to Japan, which at that time was seen as a possible model for East Asian independence. It had achieved an impressive modernization during the Meiji era and had just won the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. The Japanese authorities did not offer any direct aid for Fan Boy-Chow's military schemes, but tentatively allowed him to organize a, quote, Eastern study movement, end quote, which brought more than 200 Vietnamese students to Japan to learn about modern developments there and elsewhere in the outside world, to meet insurgents from China and other Asian countries, and to be able to discuss anti-colonial strategies without censorship or fear of arrest. Under French diplomatic pressure, they were all expelled from Japan in 1909. Fan Boy-Chow relocated to Siam and then to China. The 1911 Chinese Revolution influenced him to go beyond monarchism, and in 1912 he formed the Vietnam Restoration Society, dedicated to establishing a democratic republic by means of armed struggle. Over the next few years, this organization carried out or inspired a number of assassinations and abortive revolts in Vietnam, and Fan Boy-Chow was sentenced to death in absentia. In 1925, Fan Boy-Chow was kidnapped in Shanghai, brought back to Vietnam, and sentenced to hard labor for life. Pardoned by Governor General Varenne, Fan Boy-Chow lived under house arrest in Hue until his death. Fan Boy-Chow had made some significant breaks from previous anti-colonial revolts, which had generally been limited to reactionary nativist perspectives, appeals for loyalty to the emperor and for the restoration of the Confucian feudal system. But his social awareness was minimal. His foreign-based organizations failed to generate any sustained movement within Vietnam, and his schemes to elicit support from other countries invariably fell through. His influence was primarily an inspiring symbol of perseverance in the struggle for national independence. Fan Boy-Chow can be contrasted in many ways with his slightly younger contemporary, Phan Chau Trinh, who lived from 1872 to 1926. While Fan Boy-Chow focused exclusively on driving out the French without paying much attention to social questions, and was late into his life quite willing to use monarchism as a rallying point, Phan Chau Trinh was sharply opposed to monarchism and to the whole Mandarin feudal system, and wished to use certain aspects of French culture to challenge that system and revolutionize traditional Vietnamese society. He was a great admirer of Rousseau and Montesquieu. Phan Chau Trinh was also dubious about the advisability of violent struggle against the far superior French forces, and favored a more gradual strategy centering on education and cultural issues. Fan Boy-Chow pointed out that despite France's pretense of, quote, civilizing, end quote, the natives, its colonial system brutally repressed any potentially subversive education, resisting even rather minimal attempts to foster literacy, let alone any dissemination of the values of the French Enlightenment. Phan Chau Trinh was all too aware of that brutality. He had done time at Poilo Condor, but he noted that the scattered attempts at violent resistance encouraged by Fan Boy-Chow's groups had led to nothing but horrendous repression and demoralization. It should be noted, however, that the two leaders' strategies were complementary as well as contradictory. Fan Boy-Chow's organizations had close connections with, quote, free schools and, quote, culture centers, end quote, within Vietnam, which spread knowledge of modern subjects such as science, geography, and history to thousands of ordinary people, which also served as centers for public discussion and popular drama, as libraries and publishings, disseminating subversive poems, songs, satires, and translations of Western works. The most popular speaker at these centers was Phan Chau Trinh, before he was imprisoned and then exiled in France. Phan Chau Trinh's challenging of traditional values undoubtedly had a significant influence on the multifaceted cultural ferment of the 1920s. Yet Phan Chau Trinh's death in 1926 ironically served as a catalyst for more direct political confrontations of the sort that Phan Chau Trinh had tried to avoid, confrontations which were at the same time far more socially complex than the militaristic attacks that had been envisaged by Fan Boy-Chow. For an informative account of this early period, see David Marr's Vietnamese Anti-Colonialism, 1885 to 1925. Page 162. Famine. In 1944 and 1945, between 1 and 2 million people died of starvation in Tonkin and northern Annam. This was partly due to bad weather and to the war, but also to the fact that Governor General Decoux had hoarded over 500,000 barrels of rice for profitable export. Page 168. Quote, the first printed publication, end quote, A reminder of the difficulties of radical publication under the colonial regime. Most leaflets, newsletters, etc. were secretly produced by various crude forms of mimeographing. Page 169. 1929, Indo-Chinese Communist Party. In 1929, several different, quote, communist, end quote, groups of tendencies existing in various regions of Vietnam, including Thanh Nguyen and, quote, a non-communist party, end quote, and a, quote, Indo-Chinese Communist Party, end quote. In 1930, most of these groups merged to form the Vietnam Communist Party. On Comintern orders, this name was changed to Indo-Chinese Communist Party, see Note 50. In 1929, Indo-Chinese Communist Party the 1929 Indo-Chinese Communist Party referred to here was the earlier group. Page 179. Neville and Rousset had abandoned the Trotskyist Party on the grounds that the Stalinists were carrying out the revolution through their post-war takeover of Eastern Europe, and thereby undermined the basis of the Trotskyist positions. Nguyen Van Lien implied that he and his comrades had not endured the brutal struggles against the Stalinists only to capitulate to the Stalinists on such a bizarre and flimsy, quote, theoretical, end quote, basis. I'm assuming that refers to Pierre Neville and, is it also Pierre Rousset? I don't know. There's a guy with a similar name to Rousset who's like the expert, well, not an expert, like the main commentator within like mainstream Orthodox international Trotskyism. I think it's not Viewpoint Mag, but it's like International Viewpoint might be the website called, but he has a lot of things about like I don't know, like the Philippines and places like that. I want to see if there's anything in the index real quick about if I was right. David Rousset is actually who it is. So French LO, which I think is like a lutte ouvrière. But I think it might be the same guy actually. Now that I'm thinking about it, it's like David Rousseau, or I guess it would be not Rousseau, David Rousset. And Pierre Neville was also an Orthodox Trotskyist. I believe it's Pierre Neville. Let's see. All right. I'm right. God, I'm so infinitely knowledgeable. It's insane. Neville and Rousset had abandoned the Trotskyist Party on the grounds that the Stalinists were carrying out the revolution through their post-war takeover of East Europe and thereby undermined the basis of the Trotskyist positions. Nguyen Van Lien implied that he and his comrades had not endured the brutal struggle against the Stalinists only to capitulate to them on such a bizarre and flimsy, quote, theoretical, end quote, basis. Page 179, quotation from Chin Fu Nam, Lament of a Soldier's Wife, an 18th century poem by Dong Chan Kong. Page 184. For reasons both personal and political, No Van said very little about his family in his published writings. By the time he emigrated to France, he had become estranged from the partner mentioned on page 108. He had 3 children, son Do, born 1932, daughter Uan, born 1935, and son Da, born 1943. Da joined Van in France in 1956. Do was among the quote, boat people, end quote, who escaped from Vietnam during the late 1970s. He too came to France. Uan stayed in Vietnam and did not see her father again until 1997, during the trip mentioned in Hélène Fleury's introductory essay. Page 185. Au Pays de Héloïse, I don't know where, de Héloïse, consists of several fragmentary chapters. The excerpts translated in the present book have been rearranged and in a few cases condensed. This paragraph, for example, is a very brief summary of a several-page account in the original book about the tribulations of Vietnamese drafted into European service during World War II. No Van's friend Dong Van Long later wrote a whole book on the topic, Nuit Viet au Pape, 1940 to 1954. The Vietnamese in France, 1940 to 1954. Page 188. Lines from Baudelaire's poem Les Horloges, The Clock. Page 189. Quotation from Marx's The Poverty of Philosophy of 1847. Chapter 1, Part 2. Page 95. Source of quotation unknown. Page 201, Maximilien Rubel, 1905 to 1996. Born in what is now Ukraine, Rubel emigrated to Vienna, then to France in 1931. Maximilien Rubel was noted for his numerous works re-examining Marx's actual writings and positions as opposed to those of the various movements claiming to be, quote, Marxist, end quote. In articles such as, quote, Marx is a theorist of anarchism, end quote, which is on this channel, Rubel showed how the state socialist currents, Leninism, Trotskyism, Stalinism, social democracy, etc., are inconsistent with Marx's perspective, and in particular how the Bolshevik seizure of state power in 1917 was quite the contrary of the autonomous activity of the working class envisaged by Marx. After Rubel's death, Novon published a small book in memory of their friendship and shared struggles, Avec Maximilien Rubel, une amitié, une lutte, 1954 to 1996. Page 203, ICO, founded in 1958, originally under the name Information et Liaison Ouvrière. ICO stemmed from a split in the Socialissimo Barbarie group after the dissolution of ICO. In 1973, some of the ICO's participants, including Novon, carried on similar activities and publications in the Échange et Mouvement network, which was formed in 1975 and is still active. I'm wondering if Maximilien Rubel had connection with the ICO. The other person I associate with the ICO is Henri Simon. There's actually a documentary about Henri Simon, either on YouTube or somewhere, that actually has English translations if you look for it. I have a book by ICO that I haven't read. It's about Poland in the early 70s. It's from the early 70s, but what was I going to say? Yeah. I'm very much interested. I feel like what the most... this is just a side note for myself, but I feel like, I'm maybe one day I'll be the one to do this. But maybe not, but probably not. But I think one of the most rich things for critical theory to do would be try to kind of theoreticians to do, would be try to situate these kind of radical anti-Leninist communist groups and just the radical democratic theory in France in general, put that in dialogue with the Frankfurt School, particularly the Frankfurt School errors that drew on Neue Marxlektura. I mean, there's obviously been some things like that. There's I think it was an endnotes, communism and value farm theory, which is actually how I learned had reference points to a lot of other Marxist theoreticians. But I think one of the big ones that I think is one of the most impressive books, and probably one of the most impressive thinkers that I think is in the game right now, is Christos Mannos. I think he has written some very brilliant essays, trying to connect critical theory to revolutionary politics and libertarian communist politics. There's a really good book by Christos Mannos on this channel. About Cornelius Castoriadis, and there's also great things by him on this channel. One's about council communist and anarchist interpretations of the Bolshevik Revolution, and also about the series of letters between Castoriadis and Anton Pannekoek in the early 1950s about the nature of the Russian Revolution. Both of those pieces are interesting. I think Mannos is a little less sympathetic than I am to the idea of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 being a bourgeois revolution with red flags. I'm more sympathetic to that analysis, that council communist, which is usually associated with council communist analysis of the Russian Revolution, as opposed to things that are a little bit more influenced by Trotskyism, including Castoriadis, that kind of viewed the Bolshevik Revolution as a workers' revolution that degenerated. Yeah, there's which all depends on how. I think a large part of how you would consider that is how much stock you put into the notion that the Bolsheviks took all power to the Soviets seriously, which I think people more steeped in like the first wave of council communists don't take particularly seriously. I think people who come to more libertarian positions that come from Trotskyism a lot of times, like Castoriadis, at least in the early 1950s, viewed that as took the all power to the Soviets concept seriously, as a like that the Bolsheviks were sincere in that project. I think he becomes more critical. I think it's probably one of the limitations of the essay, as well as like at least like because talking about that particular debate at that particular time will be interesting. The imagined sequel to that essay by Christos Mamos would be about Castoriadis' later views of the Russian Revolution, which I think would be a little bit more critical of early Bolshevism than he was in the early 1950s. But what was I going to say? But who knows? But anyway, Christos Mamos, really good book from Cornelius Castoriadis, really good essays. He has a book apparently coming out that's on open Marxism, just like basically like an intellectual like overview of open Marxism, which I don't know where he draws the line of what constitutes open Marxism or not. But obviously it would be about the journal's open Marxism, so I imagine people like Werner Bonefeld, John Holloway, but also people like, Reichholtz in that journal, Robert Fiennes, and that has appeared in that journal, Heide Gerstenberger's appeared in that journal, Harry Cleaver, maybe Antonio Negri has also appeared in that journal. So I don't know like what all constitutes, like open Marxism seems like a very open thing. So I wonder what boundaries are going to draw on that openness. I know there's other people who have used the term open Marxism. I think the big one for Christos Mamos is I think it's Kostas Axelos, who's like another Greek come French anti-dogmatic Marxist. But yeah, I'm just curious. I'm really excited to read that book. I can't wait till it comes out. So it's funny. There's only been 2 people I think who I've read things from who've ever reached out to me, and said like "What's up" or "Thank you" or something like that. It's like I don't even know who listens to this. I feel like I don't know. I'm not sure who would even listen to like audiobooks like this, but like the 2 people that have reached out thus far have been Christoph Fringeli, to a limited extent. I don't think you've reached out, but I've like talked to the guy a little bit on YouTube. From Data Side, who has put out some very excellent articles that I really sucked a lot out of in my own like understanding of like particularly post World War II radical left milieu, like his analysis of that. And then also recently Eve Coleman has who wrote the book like Neither Fatherlands or Frontier Borders or something like that, reached out and thanked me for recording some of his stuff. But in my dream world, I want Christos Mamos to reach out to me and tell me how thankful he is for me reading his things. Not that he should be, but it would be nice in my dream world. Anyway, where am I? Fuck, what the hell was the last thing I read? Yeah, basically, I don't know where the hell I went off with that, but I think it would be, one of the most fruitful things would be to kind of try to, like, combine radical I guess, radical democratic or radical libertarian left thought of France in the post-war era, with the work of the Frankfurt School, particularly that which tries to steep itself more thoroughly in the Marxist critique of political economy. Anyway, page 204, Little Red Book, quotations from Chairman Mao. Noah Van Letter wrote a critique of this collection and of Maoism in general. See bibliography, page 248. Page 207, CFDT, Confédération Française Démocratique du Travail, French Democratic Confederation of Labor, socialist-leaning National Labor Union. Page 208, CGT, Confédération Générale du Travail / General Confederation of Labor, National Labor Union dominated by the French Communist Party. Page 210, quote, know how to end a strike, end quote. In 1936, during the strikes accompanying the election of the Popular Front, Communist Party leader Maurice Thorez declared, quote, we must recognize when it's time to determine a strike to terminate a strike if our demands are met, and when it's time to consent to a compromise, if not all of them are won, end quote. The French expression, quote, il faut savoir terminer une grève, end quote, can also be understood as, quote, we must know how to end a strike, end quote. And ever since that time, this accidental confession of union bureaucrats' actual conservative role has been sarcastically evoked by radical workers. Grenelle Accords, an agreement negotiated between May 25th and 27th, 1938 at the Ministry of Social Affairs on Rue de Grenelle in Paris by Jacques Chirac, representing the government, Georges Seguy representing the labor unions, and the French Confederation of Business Enterprises representing the bosses. The agreement, which called for a 25% increase in the minimum wage, a 10% increase in average real wages, and some other benefits, was rejected by the rank-and-file workers. Waldeck Rocher, head of the French Communist Party. Communards, partisans of the Paris Commune 1871, Versailles, seat of the French Third Republic government that massacred the Communards. Page 211, UNEF, Union Nationale des Étudiants de France, French National Student Union. March 22nd Union, eclectic radical student organization created on March 22nd, 1968. The anarchist Daniel Cohn-Bendit was its famous spokesperson, but it also included Trotskyists, Maoists, etc. To my understanding, the Bendit brothers, I think it's did they both write the book? I think it might be Daniel Cohn-Bendit. I think there's a Gabriel Cohn-Bendit, who's like a lesser known figure. I don't know if he helped write the book, but their book, Obsolete Communism, I think draws heavily, even maybe perhaps to the point of plagiarism, from excerpts from Société Semo Barbarie. Page 219, Tet Offensive, a nationally coordinated military campaign launched by the Viet Cong on January 30th, 1938, Vietnamese New Year. Although the campaign was very costly in Viet Cong lives, it succeeded in shocking and demoralizing the American public, making it more difficult for the American government to claim that victory was just around the corner. Page 220, Allusion to the International War Crimes Tribunal, 1966-1967, organized by Bertrand Russell and Jean-Paul Sartre. Page 221, the, quote, popular sentiment, end quote, was a widespread anti-Americanism not only on the part of French Communist Party supporters, but also by President de Gaulle, who was striving to carve out an independent position, e.g. by withdrawing France from NATO, and in the process aligning France closer to the Communist bloc. Okay, so that's the end of the translator's notes to No Vons in the Crossfire, Adventures of a Vietnamese Revolutionary. The editors, where am I? The translator's notes, it says that the book was translated by from the French by Helene Fleury, Hilary Horrocks, Ken Nab, and Naomi Sager. So I don't know who did most of the legwork in creating that translators, those translator notes, but it was written by all or one of them. Thank you for listening.